Imagine you are a 19-year-old infantryman from Ohio, crouched in a hedgerow somewhere in Normandy in June of 1944. Your squad has been ordered to advance across an open field, maybe 200 yards, to the tree line on the other side. Your sergeant gives the signal, and you rise from cover, your M1 Garand clutched tight against your chest. You make it maybe 10 steps before you hear it. It doesn't sound like a machine gun. It sounds like the world's largest sheet of canvas being torn in half. A buzzsaw ripping through sheet metal. A zipper being pulled by God himself. The sound is so fast, so unnaturally rapid, that your brain cannot process individual shots. It is just one continuous, demonic BRRT that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Men around you are falling. Not one at a time, but in groups, cut down so fast they barely have time to scream. You dive for the ground, pressing your face into the dirt, and the sound continues. Tracers are snapping over your head in an almost solid stream of light. Clumps of earth explode around you. You realize with absolute clarity that if you lift your head even 6 inches, you will die. You have just encountered the MG42, the Maskeningewehre 42, and in this moment, pinned in the mud with your heart hammering against your ribs, you understand why veterans who survived the war would say decades later, "I never feared the German rifle. I never feared the German tank. But I feared that gun." This is the story of the weapon that American infantrymen came to dread above all others, not because it was exotic or high-tech, but because it was devastatingly, horrifically effective. This is the story of Hitler's buzzsaw, the sound that haunted a generation. To understand why the MG42 inspired such visceral terror, we must start not with its mechanics, but with its sound. Every veteran who faced it remembers that sound. In oral histories, memoirs, and interviews recorded decades after the war, American combat soldiers return again and again to the same description. It didn't sound like other guns. The American Browning M1919A4 machine gun, the standard medium machine gun of the U.S. infantry, fired at a rate of approximately 400 to 600 rounds per minute. When it fired, you could hear distinct individual shots. Tack, 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 tack. The same was true of the British Bren gun and most other Allied machine guns. Even when firing in long bursts, these weapons produced a rhythmic, staccato beat. Experienced soldiers could count the shots. They could time the pauses. They could predict when the gunner would need to change barrels or reload. The MG42 fired at 1,200 rounds per minute. Some sources cite rates as high as 1,500 rounds per minute depending on the bolt configuration. At this cyclic rate, the human ear cannot distinguish individual reports. The gunfire merges into a single, continuous roar, a sound so distinctive that American troops developed an entire vocabulary around it. Hitler's buzzsaw. Hitler's zipper. The ripsaw. Hitlersich. This wasn't just a curiosity. The sound had profound psychological and tactical implications. When an American squad heard the sharp bark of a Browning, they knew they were facing a machine gun position. They could locate it, estimate distance, and plan accordingly. When they heard the MG42, the sound was so overwhelming, so all-consuming, that it was difficult to pinpoint its origin. The high rate of fire created an acoustic effect that seemed to fill the entire battlefield. Soldiers reported feeling that the fire was coming from multiple directions simultaneously. More insidiously, the sound conveyed raw, mechanical violence in a way slower guns did not. The sheer speed of it communicated one message: you cannot possibly move fast enough to escape this. It bypassed rational thought and struck directly at the primal survival instinct. Veterans described a freezing effect, an instant where the sound alone made men hesitate, duck, or dive for cover even before they saw where the bullets were impacting. One American infantryman, interviewed years later, put it simply, "When you heard that zipper, you knew you were in the wrong place. And you knew that someone was going to die." The machine behind the terror. The MG42 was not some wonder weapon spawned from a secret Nazi laboratory. It was born from desperate necessity. By 1942, Germany was fighting a multi-front war against enemies who vastly outnumbered them. The existing German machine gun, the MG34, was an excellent weapon, accurate, reliable, and versatile. But it had one fatal flaw: it was expensive and time-consuming to manufacture. The MG34 required extensive machining, skilled labor, and precious materials that Germany increasingly could not afford. German engineers were tasked with creating a machine gun that could be mass-produced using stamped metal parts and minimal machining. The result was the MG42, designed by Dr. Ing. Werner Gruner at Grossfuss AG Dobeln. It entered service in 1942, and by 1945, over 400,000 had been produced, a staggering number that reflected both its effectiveness and its manufacturability. The genius of the MG42 lay in its mechanical simplicity. Unlike the MG34, which used a rotating bolt mechanism, the MG42 employed a roller-locked bolt system. Here's how it worked. When the trigger was pulled, the bolt moved forward, stripping a round from the belt and chambering it. As the bolt closed, two cylindrical rollers were forced outward into recesses in the receiver, locking the bolt in place. The cartridge fired, and the recoil drove the bolt backward. A cam mechanism forced the rollers inward, unlocking the bolt, which then continued rearward, ejecting the spent casing. A powerful recoil spring then drove the bolt forward again to repeat the cycle. This system was brilliantly engineered. The roller lock mechanism was strong enough to handle the immense pressures of firing, yet simple enough to manufacture from stamped and welded parts. The entire process, feed, chamber, lock, fire, unlock, extract, eject, and reload, occurred in a fraction of a second. The result was a cyclic rate that was nearly double that of comparable Allied weapons. But high rate of fire came with challenges. Heat was the primary enemy. At 1,200 rounds per minute, the barrel heated to glowing temperatures in seconds. The MG42 addressed this with a quick-change barrel system. A trained gunner could swap a barrel in under 5 seconds. A lever released the barrel, the gunner pulled it out using an asbestos mitt, slammed in a cool barrel, and locked it back in place. German machine gun teams carried multiple spare barrels and were trained to swap them every 250 rounds or after approximately 12 to 15 seconds of sustained fire. The weapon fed from non-disintegrating metal link belts holding 50 rounds, typically carried in drum containers or belt boxes holding 250 rounds. In sustained defensive fire, ammunition bearers would link belts together, allowing for nearly continuous fire as long as barrels were changed regularly. The MG42 weighed 25.5 pounds, 11.6 kilograms, lighter than the Browning M1919A4 despite its higher performance. It could be fired from a bipod by one man, mounted on a tripod for sustained fire, or even fired from the hip in assault positions using a special drum magazine. This versatility meant it could serve as both a light machine gun and a medium/heavy machine gun, simplifying logistics. From an engineering standpoint, it was a masterpiece, cheaper, faster to produce, lighter, more reliable, and significantly more lethal than its predecessor. The Americans had nothing comparable. How Germany built their defense around the MG42. The true nightmare of the MG42 wasn't just the weapon itself, it was how the Germans used it. Understanding German infantry doctrine is essential to understanding why American GIs feared this gun so deeply. In the American and British armies, the infantry squad was built around the rifleman. The squad's automatic weapon, typically a Browning automatic rifle, BAR, for the Americans, was a support weapon. Its job was to provide covering fire so the rifleman could maneuver. The German infantry squad, the Gruppe, was built entirely around the machine gun. The MG42 wasn't a support weapon. It was the weapon. Everything else existed to serve it. A typical German Gruppe consisted of 10 men. One Gruppenführer, squad leader, one MG42 gunner, shoots a 1, one assistant gunner, shoots a 2, 6 riflemen/ammunition bearers, one messenger. The gunner and assistant gunner were the most important men in the squad. The rifleman's job was not to engage the enemy directly. It was to carry ammunition, protect the gun crew, and provide local security. In defensive positions, the entire squad's position was selected based on where the MG42 could best be employed. Fields of fire, interlocking fire lanes, grazing fire across likely approach routes, all calculated around the machine gun. This doctrine meant that when American infantrymen attacked a German position, they were not facing scattered rifle fire with occasional machine gun bursts. They were facing positions where every defensive advantage had been engineered to maximize the killing power of the MG42. German defenders would sight their guns in mutually supporting positions, creating overlapping fields of fire. If an American squad managed to flank one MG42 position, they would move directly into the kill zone of another. The guns were often positioned in defilade, hidden behind terrain features, so they were invisible until they opened fire. Gunners were trained to wait until attacking infantry were at optimal range, typically 400 meters or closer, before opening fire. This patience maximized casualties and psychological shock. The Germans also employed the concept of grazing fire, positioning the gun so that bullets would pass no higher than 1 meter above the ground across the entire beaten zone. This meant that a soldier could not take cover by going prone. The only escape was to reach dead ground behind a terrain feature, and the Germans carefully selected positions to minimize such refuges. When defending in depth, German doctrine called for panzernist, hedgehog positions, small, hardened strong points, each containing one or more MG42s, distributed across the defensive zone. These positions were designed to be bypassed by attacking infantry, then to fire into the attacker's flanks and rear. Combined with pre-registered mortar and artillery fire, this created a killing field where American infantry were torn apart from multiple directions simultaneously. American soldiers quickly learned that charging a German position was not like the training scenarios back in the States. The training films showed machine guns firing in short, predictable bursts. The reality was a hurricane of lead that could saw a man in half. Normandy, the bocage killing fields. Nowhere was the nightmare of the MG42 more evident than in the hedgerow country of Normandy following D-Day. The bocage, ancient farmland divided by thick earthen berms topped with dense vegetation, was ideal defensive terrain, and the Germans exploited it with murderous efficiency. Each hedgerow was a potential fortress. German defenders would dig the MG42 into the base of the hedgerow, creating a narrow firing slit with overhead cover. The gun would be positioned to fire down the length of adjacent fields, creating enfilade fire. When American infantry emerged from one hedgerow to cross the field to the next, they were silhouetted against the sky and caught in a pre-sighted kill zone. The 90th Infantry Division, entering combat in Normandy in June 1944, suffered catastrophic casualties in the first days. The division's after-action reports describe German defensive positions as being built around automatic weapons. American rifle squads, trained to advance by fire and maneuver, found themselves unable to maneuver. The moment they rose to move, the MG42s opened up. One sergeant from the 29th Infantry Division described the experience. You couldn't see them. You couldn't hear them until they fired. And when they fired, it was like someone turned on a fire hose. We'd have boys get hit 5, 6 times before they hit the ground. The gun was so fast, you couldn't get down fast enough. The casualty patterns were distinctive. Whereas slower machine guns might wound one man in a squad before the others could dive for cover, the MG42's rate of fire meant that multiple men were often hit in the first burst. Medics reported that soldiers hit by MG42 fire typically had multiple wounds. The gun's fire was so dense that a man caught in the open would be struck repeatedly in the seconds before he fell. American infantry tactics had to adapt rapidly. Standard doctrine called for suppressing the machine gun with rifle and bar fire while a fire team maneuvered to flank it. But the MG42's sustained fire capability and the German practice of mutual support meant that suppression was nearly impossible. A Browning gunner who stood up to return fire would be cut down in seconds. Bar men learned to fire from prone positions, but the bar's 20-round magazine was pathetically inadequate against a weapon that could fire 250 rounds without stopping. Increasingly, American squads learned to call for artillery or tank support rather than attempt frontal assaults. But in the close terrain of the bocage, this wasn't always possible. Units developed new tactics. Smoke grenades to obscure movement, satchel charges and bazookas to blast through hedgerows rather than crossing open fields, and small unit infiltration at night to get close before the MG42 could engage effectively. The psychological toll was immense. Men who survived the initial landing on Omaha Beach said the hedgerow fighting was worse. At least on the beach, you knew where the fire was coming from. In the bocage, the MG42 could be anywhere, invisible and inaudible until it opened fire. The fear became so pervasive that some units experienced paralysis, men simply refusing to move across open ground. Technical disparity. To truly understand the American infantryman's fear, we must compare the weapons directly. When a U.S. machine gun team faced off against a German MG42 crew, the disparity was stark. Rate of fire. Browning M1919A4, 400 to 600 rounds per minute. MG42, 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute. This means that in any given second, the MG42 could put 2 to 3 times as many bullets downrange. In practical terms, this translated to a far denser beaten zone, the area where bullets impacted. A soldier trying to cross an MG42's field of fire had half to 1/3 the chance of making it compared to crossing a Browning's fire. Barrel change speed. Browning M1919A4, 2 to 3 minutes, required tools and significant disassembly. MG42, 3 to 5 seconds, quick-release lever system. This was perhaps the most critical tactical difference. The Browning could overheat quickly, especially in sustained defensive fire. and changing the barrel was a complex process that left the gun out of action for several minutes. The MG42's barrel could be swapped almost instantly. In practice, this meant that a German gun could maintain sustained fire indefinitely as long as ammunition lasted, while an American gun would have to cease fire periodically. With Browning M1919A4, 31 pounds, gun alone, 41 plus pounds with tripod MG42, 25.5 pounds, gun alone, 42 pounds with tripod. Despite firing faster, the MG42 was lighter, making it more mobile. Effective range. Both weapons, approximately 1,000 meters maximum, 800 meters effective. Here they were comparable, though the MG42's higher rate of fire gave it an advantage in hit probability at all ranges. Reliability. Browning M1919A4, exceptionally reliable, proven design MG42, very reliable, though more susceptible to mud/dirt due to larger tolerances. This was one area where the Browning held an advantage. Its tight machining and closed action made it less prone to jamming in adverse conditions. However, the MG42 was still remarkably reliable for a weapon produced under wartime conditions with stamped parts. The Americans did have the M1917 and M2 Browning .50 caliber heavy machine guns, which were superb weapons. The .50 cal in particular was feared by the Germans. But these were heavy, crew-served weapons that could not be moved quickly by infantry squads. In a fluid infantry firefight, it was the M1919 versus the MG42, and the MG42 held nearly every advantage. American soldiers knew this. They knew their gun was slower, heavier, and harder to keep in action. They knew that in a straight-up firefight, the German gun crew had the edge. This knowledge ate at morale and forced tactical adaptations that often resulted in higher casualties. If the bocage was bad, the Hurtgen Forest was hell. The Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, fought from September 1944 to February 1945, was the longest single battle the U.S. Army fought in World War II. It was also one of the bloodiest, with over 33,000 American casualties. The MG42 played a defining role in that slaughter. The Hurtgen was a dense, dark forest of fir trees along the German-Belgian border. Visibility was measured in meters. The terrain was broken by steep ravines, logging trails, and fire breaks, natural lanes of fire perfectly suited for machine gun ambushes. The Germans had months to prepare defenses, and they used every advantage. MG42 positions were sited to cover every trail, every firebreak, every approach. The forest was so thick that flanking maneuvers were nearly impossible. Infantry had to advance along predictable routes, and the Germans had a gun waiting at each one. Worse, the dense tree canopy made artillery support difficult. American shells would detonate in the treetops, creating deadly airbursts of wood splinters but often failing to suppress the dug-in defenders. The 28th Infantry Division entered the Hurtgen in early November 1944. Within days, it had suffered over 6,000 casualties, nearly 40% of its strength. After-action reports described German defensive positions as being mutually supporting, centered on automatic weapons, with excellent fields of fire. In the dense forest, American soldiers often didn't see the MG42 position until the muzzle flash, and by then, it was too late. One particularly horrific example occurred at the town of Schmidt. American forces managed to capture the town, but German counterattacks cut off the advance units. The only route of withdrawal was down a forest trail dubbed the Call Trail. German defenders positioned multiple MG42s to create interlocking fire along the trail. American soldiers attempting to retreat or reinforce had to run a gauntlet of machine gun fire. The trail became a killing ground. Wounded men who fell in the open were often hit repeatedly by passing fire. Medics who tried to reach them were cut down. Lieutenant Paul Bosch, an officer with the 28th Division, later wrote, "The German machine guns were the heart of their defense. They were everywhere, hidden in log bunkers, sighted to cover every approach. You couldn't see them, couldn't flank them, couldn't suppress them. They just sat there and tore us apart." The Hurtgen Forest broke entire units. Battalions that entered at full strength emerged as shattered remnants. Combat exhaustion rates soared. The mud, the cold, the darkness, and the omnipresent threat of the MG42 created conditions that men described as worse than anything else in the war. Acts of valor. Despite the terror, despite the odds, American infantrymen found the courage to stand and fight. The Medal of Honor citations from the European theater are filled with accounts of men who charged MG42 positions alone, knowing they would likely die. One such man was Staff Sergeant Curtis F. Shoup, serving with the 346th Infantry Regiment in France. On April 3, 1945, near the town of Sevenig, Germany, Schoep's company was pinned down by heavy machine gun fire from 3 MG42 positions. Men were being hit, unable to advance or retreat. The attack was stalling. Without orders, without support, Schoep rose from cover and charged the nearest position alone. He fired his M1 Garand as he ran, drawing the fire of all 3 guns onto himself. Bullets tore through his uniform, but he kept going. He reached the first position and killed the crew with grenades and rifle fire. Wounded now, bleeding from multiple hits, he turned toward the second gun. The MG42 opened up at point-blank range. Schoep was hit repeatedly but managed to close the distance and destroy the second position. The third gun, now desperately trying to traverse onto him, fired a long burst that nearly cut him in half. Schoep fell, but his sacrifice had drawn the fire away from his pinned comrades. Another squad was able to maneuver and destroy the third gun. Schoep died of his wounds. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. His story was not unique. Time and again, American soldiers made the terrible calculus. The only way to save the squad was for one man to draw the MG42's fire, giving others a chance to flank or advance. These were acts of conscious self-sacrifice, born from the desperate reality that the gun's rate of fire was so high that frontal suppression was nearly impossible. Another example, Private First Class Harold A. Garman, 3rd Infantry Division, fighting in France in August 1944. His platoon was crossing an open field when 3 MG42s opened fire from a wooded area 200 yards away. The platoon hit the dirt, men falling all around. Garman, a barman, realized that his weapon, with its 20-round magazine, could not suppress the German guns long enough for his comrades to escape. He stood up. In full view of the enemy guns, walking upright, he advanced across the open field, firing his bar from the shoulder. The MG42s focused their fire on him. He was hit multiple times but continued walking forward, changing magazines, firing. He walked 200 yards, nearly 2 football fields, under continuous machine gun fire, his body absorbing dozens of rounds. He made it to within 30 yards of the nearest position before he fell, dead. His incredible act drew the fire long enough for his platoon to withdraw. Medal of Honor, posthumous. These stories are heartbreaking, but they illustrate a critical point. The MG42 was so lethal that sometimes the only tactical solution was human sacrifice. American small unit tactics increasingly relied on heroic individual action because standard fire and maneuver doctrines simply did not work against the MG42's rate of fire and the German defensive doctrine that supported it. The psychological scar. The MG42's impact extended far beyond the physical casualties it inflicted. It created a psychological shadow that hung over American infantry for the entire war. Combat psychiatrists noted that soldiers who had been pinned by MG42 fire often developed acute stress reactions. The sound alone was enough to trigger panic responses in veterans who had survived previous encounters. In rest areas behind the lines, the sound of a jeep backfiring or a truck engine could send men diving for cover, their minds instantly returning to that terrible ripping sound. The weapon also contributed to a broader sense of German tactical superiority in defensive fighting. American soldiers saw themselves as part of a technologically advanced, well-supplied army. They had air superiority, artillery superiority, and numerical superiority. And yet, one well-sighted MG42 could stop an entire company cold. This created a cognitive dissonance. If we're supposed to be better, why are we the ones dying in the fields? This psychological burden manifested in several ways. Some units became overly cautious, refusing to advance without overwhelming fire support. This slowed the pace of operations and led to friction with commanders who wanted aggressive action. Other units became reckless, taking unnecessary casualties in frontal assaults because they felt pressured to prove they weren't cowards. The fear was so pervasive that American intelligence and training units made special efforts to address it. Training films were produced showing how to assault German machine gun positions. Pamphlets were distributed explaining the MG42's weaknesses. It jammed occasionally, it needed barrel changes, the gunner had limited peripheral vision. But these rational explanations did little to counter the visceral terror of being under that fire. One veteran, interviewed in the 1990s for an oral history project, said, "You can't explain it to someone who wasn't there. That sound, it didn't just scare you. It reached inside and grabbed something primal. Every cell in your body screamed run. The guys who stood up anyway, who moved toward that sound, I don't know where they found the courage. I honestly don't." After the war. When the war ended, American ordnance officers were quick to study captured MG42s. They were impressed, grudgingly, but genuinely. The weapon's design influenced post-war machine gun development worldwide. The US would eventually adopt the M60 machine gun in the 1950s, which borrowed heavily from the MG42's operating system, though executed poorly in its initial variants. The MG42 itself continued in service. The West German Bundeswehr adopted a modified version chambered in 7.62mm NATO, designated the MG3, which remains in service to this day with over 70 countries. At over 80 years old, the basic design is still considered viable. But perhaps the most telling legacy is in the stories. When American World War II veterans gathered at reunions, in VFW halls, or around family tables, the MG42 appeared again and again in their accounts. It was the thing they remembered, the thing that haunted them. Not the Tiger tanks that feature so prominently in popular history. Not the V-2 rockets or the jet fighters. The machine gun. The sound. Historian Stephen Ambrose, who interviewed hundreds of American veterans for his books on World War II, noted that the MG42 came up in conversations more than almost any other German weapon. They remembered it viscerally, he wrote. Decades later, old men would describe the sound and their hands would start shaking. Conclusion. The right weapon, the right doctrine, the wrong side. The MG42 was not the most technologically sophisticated weapon of World War II. It was not the most powerful. It did not have the longest range or the greatest accuracy. What it had was a perfect marriage of engineering, manufacturing, and tactical doctrine that created a weapon system optimized for defensive warfare. For the American infantrymen who faced it, young men, many barely out of high school, advancing across the fields of France and the forests of Germany, the MG42 represented something more than a weapon. It was the physical embodiment of German tactical excellence, of the lethal competence of the Wehrmacht in defense. It was the thing that made them afraid. They feared it because it gave no warning. The slower Allied machine guns announced themselves with distinct, rhythmic fire. The MG42's continuous roar seemed to come from everywhere at once, disorienting and terrifying. They feared it because it was so fast that once it opened fire, escape was nearly impossible. Men who had dodged rifle fire, who had survived artillery barrages, found themselves helpless against the MG42's rate of fire. They feared it because the Germans used it so well. Every defensive position was built around it. Every field of fire was calculated for maximum lethality. The weapon was never alone. It was always part of a mutually supporting system designed to kill. And they feared it because facing it required a special kind of courage. When your squad was pinned by an MG42, someone had to stand up and move toward that sound. Someone had to draw its fire. Often, that someone didn't come back. The Americans won the war despite the MG42, not because they defeated it in a technical sense, but because they had the numbers, the air power, the logistics, and above all, the courage to keep advancing into its fire. They paid a terrible price for that victory, a price measured in the bodies of young men cut down in French fields and German forests. The German forces may have had the MG42, but the American forces had the determination to face it, to die in front of it if necessary, and to keep coming until sheer weight of numbers and material overwhelmed even the most perfectly sighted defensive position. In the end, courage trumped firepower. But the men who provided that courage, who walked into the teeth of Hitler's buzzsaw and kept walking, earned a respect that echoes through history. The MG42 was feared because it was lethal. The American infantryman is remembered because he faced it anyway. The gun may have been a masterpiece, but the men who defeated it were heroes.